Hello, ladies and gentlemen. Good morning, everyone. Today we are going to discuss about introduction to environmental issues. Environmental issues refer to problems related to nature, ecosystem, biodiversity, pollution, climate change, disaster, deforestation, and misuse of natural resources. Environmental protection is essential for sustainable development, public health, economic prosperity, and the survival of future generations. Ladies and gentlemen, what do you mean by ecosystem? We know the ecosystem, an ecosystem is a system where living organisms interact with each other and with the physical environment. It includes biotic components like plant, animal, microorganisms, and abiotic components like air, water, soil, sunlight, etc. Ladies and gentlemen, there are many types of the ecosystem. Forest ecosystem, grassland ecosystem, aquatic ecosystem, desert ecosystem, and mountain ecosystem. Ladies and gentlemen, components of ecosystem: producers, plant producing food through photosynthesis. Every plants are producer. And ladies and gentlemen, there are another component of ecosystem are consumer. Animals depending on plant or small animals, other animals are called consumer, and decomposers. Bacteria and fungi decomposing dead organisms are called decomposers. Bacteria and fungi that decomposing dead organisms are called decomposers. Ladies and gentlemen, some importance of the ecosystem: maintains ecological balance, supports biodiversity, regulates climate, and provides food and resources. Ladies and gentlemen, there are many threats to ecosystem: pollution, deforestation, rapid urbanization, and rapid climate change increase the temperature of the earth or global warming, greenhouse effect, etc. are the many effects of the ecosystem or traits of the ecosystem. Ladies and gentlemen, the Constitution of Nepal guarantees the right to clean and healthy environment. Ecosystem is the foundation of environmental balance and life support. Ladies and gentlemen, ecosystem is the foundation of environmental balance and life support. What do you mean by biodiversity and conservation? Ladies and gentlemen, biodiversity means the variety of plants, animals, microorganisms, and different species and ecosystem. Biodiversity word, only word biodiversity means only variety. Ladies and gentlemen, types of the biodiversity: genetic diversity, species diversity, and ecosystem diversity. Ladies and gentlemen, importance of biodiversity: ecological balance, tourism promotion, medicinal resources, agricultural sustainability. Ladies and gentlemen, some conservation methods. In situ conservation. In situ conservation means protection within natural habitat, for example, national park and wildlife reserves. And ex situ conservation, ladies and gentlemen, protection outside natural habitat, for example, zoo, botanical garden, zoo for animal and botanical garden for plants. Ladies and gentlemen, there are many threats: illegal hunting, deforestation, pollution, and climate change. Ladies and gentlemen, in the Constitution of Nepal, protect forest and biodiversity, ensures environmental sustainability. Ladies and gentlemen, important protected areas in Nepal: Chitamon National Park, Sagarmatha National Park, Rara National Park, Bardia National Park, Make National Park. Biodiversity conservation is essential for ecological and economic sustainability. Economic sustainability means biodiversity promotes tourism, ladies and gentlemen, and ecological sustainability means biodiversity promotes for environmental balance. Ladies and gentlemen, what is climate change and carbon trade? Ladies and gentlemen, climate change refers to what climate change is easy, but it is difficult it is tough to define climate change topic. Ladies and gentlemen, we know that climate change refers to long-term changes in temperature, rainfall, and weather pattern, mainly caused by greenhouse gas emission. Okay, are you understand? Climate change refers to long-term changes in temperature, rainfall, and weather patterns, mainly caused by greenhouse gas emissions. Ladies and gentlemen, what are the main causes? Industrialization, deforestation, fossil fuel consumption, and pollution. Ladies and gentlemen, effects in Nepal. We know that melting glaciers, floods and landslides, soil erosion, drought, agricultural loss. Ladies and gentlemen, what is carbon trade? We know that carbon trade is a system where countries or companies buy and sell carbon emission rights to reduce greenhouse gases. Carbon trade is most significant to improve our economical condition because Nepal is in between two major giants, India and China, two major industrialized country. So carbon trade is a system where countries or companies buy and sell carbon emission rights to reduce greenhouse gases. Ladies and gentlemen, its importance is climate protection, green economic promotion, and international cooperation. Ladies and gentlemen, Nepal contributes little to global emission. Nepal contributes green. Nepal contributes little to greenhouse emission, but suffers highly from climate impact. In the world, Nepal is vulnerable for climate change. Ladies and gentlemen, the constitution ensures environmental protection, sustainable use of the natural resources. Ladies and gentlemen, there are many international agreements like as Paris Agreement, Kyoto Protocol, etc. to resolve climate change program. Ladies and gentlemen, climate change is a global program requiring collective global action to resolve it. Ladies and gentlemen, what is environmental degradation? Environmental degradation means deforestation of the environment through pollution, deforestation, overpopulation, and misuse of the resources. Are you understand? Environmental degradation means deforestation, or sorry, that is the example. Environmental degradation means deterioration of the environment through pollution, deforestation, overpopulation, and misuse of the natural resources. Ladies and gentlemen, major causes are there: industrial pollution, urbanization, rapid population growth, improper waste management. Ladies and gentlemen, there are many effects: high problems, high health problems, loss of biodiversity, loss of ecosystem, climate change, natural disaster. Ladies and gentlemen, prevention measures are also there. Environmental laws, okay, implementation of the powerful environmental laws, public awareness, sustainable development, and pollution control. Ladies and gentlemen, some constitutional aspect according to Constitution of Nepal 2015, citizens have the right to live in a clean and healthy environment. Okay, citizens have right to live in a clean and healthy environment. In Article number 30 of the Constitution of Nepal, citizens have right to living in the clean and healthy environment. Ladies and gentlemen, environmental degradation threatens sustainable development and human survival. Environmental degradation threatens sustainable development and human survival. Ladies and gentlemen, what do you mean by deforestation? Deforestation means clearing of or destruction of the forest or cutting down of the tree. That is called deforestation. Causes: rapid urbanization or unmanaged urbanization, illegal logging, agricultural expansion, infrastructure construction. Ladies and gentlemen, some effects are soil erosion, flood and landslide, climate change, and the loss of the wildlife habitat. What are the control measures, ladies and gentlemen? Afforestation, community forestry, strict legal action, and public awareness. Community forestry programs in Nepal are internationally recognized. Okay, ladies and gentlemen, constitutional provision, the state must conserve forest and natural resources. Forests are the lungs of the earth, lungs of the green planet Earth. Ladies and gentlemen, crisis and disaster management. Disaster management refers to the activities related to prevention, preparedness, response, recovery, and rehabilitation from disasters. As you understand, disaster management refers to activities related to prevention, preparedness, response, recovery, and rehabilitation from disasters. Types of the disaster: natural disaster like as earthquake, flood, landslide, drought, and human induced disaster like fire, industrial accident, and pollution. Ladies and gentlemen, disaster management cycle: preparedness, response, recovery, and mitigation. In Nepalese context, Nepal is highly disaster prone due to geography and climate vulnerability. Ladies and gentlemen, Nepal is highly disaster prone due to geography and climate vulnerability. Some importance are saves lives, saves lives, reduces economic loss, and ensure public safety. Ladies and gentlemen, the state is responsible for disaster management and citizen protection, and preparedness and mitigation reduce disaster risk. Okay, preparedness and reduce disaster risks. Ladies and gentlemen, what is environment and development? As you understand, development and environment are interrelated topics. Unplanned development harms the environment, while environment destruction weakens the development. Okay, unplanned development harms the environment, while environmental destruction weakens the development. Ladies and gentlemen, need for balance, sustainable infrastructure, green economy, and environmental impact assessment (EIA). Ladies and gentlemen, EIA studies environmental impact before development project begin. Some importance: reduces environmental damage, supports sustainable development, and protects biodiversity. Challenges in Nepal: weak implementation, rapid urbanization, and pollution. Ladies and gentlemen, the constitution supports environmentally sustainable development. Development should be environmentally sustainable and socially responsible. Ladies and gentlemen, what is energy crisis and energy conservation? Energy crisis means shortage of energy resources required for industry, transportation, and our daily life. And energy conservation means efficient and careful use of energy resources. Ladies and gentlemen, what are the major causes of the energy crisis? Increasing demand, dependency on fossil fuels, lack of infrastructure. Energy sources in Nepal, ladies and gentlemen, are renewable energy, hydropower, solar energy, wind energy, and biogas. Non-renewable energy, petroleum products, and coal. Ladies and gentlemen, conservation measures are use of renewable energy, use of clean energy, energy efficient technology, and public awareness. Some importance are reduces import dependency from neighbor countries, and environmental protection and sustainable development. Ladies and gentlemen, energy conservation is essential for sustainable economic development. Okay, energy conservation is essential for sustainable economic development. Energy conservation is essential for sustainable economic development. Okay, what is pollution and what is waste management? Ladies and gentlemen, pollution means contamination of the unwanted substance or contamination of the environment by harmful substances. And waste management means collection, transportation, recycling, and disposal of waste material properly or wisely. That is called waste management. Ladies and gentlemen, types of the pollution: air pollution, water pollution, soil pollution, and noise pollution causes industrial waste, vehicles emission, industrialization, plastic waste, and rapid urbanization or unmanaged sewage system. Ladies and gentlemen, some effects are health problem, environmental degradation, water contamination, and climate change. Ladies and gentlemen, some waste management method 3R principle: reduce, reuse, and recycling. Ladies and gentlemen, importance is public health protection, clean cities, and environmental conservation. Citizens have fundamental right to clean environment. Effective waste management promotes healthy society and sustainable environment. Ladies and gentlemen, there are Environmental Protection Act in Nepal to environmental conservation, and Forestry Act to forest management, Disaster Risk Reduction and Management Act for disaster management, and National Parks and Wildlife Conservation Act for wildlife protection. Ladies and gentlemen, finally we are going to revision of these topics: ecosystem, interaction of living and non-living things, okay, and biodiversity, variety of living organisms, climate change, long-term change in the weather pattern, temperature, environment, etc. Deforestation, destruction of the forest or cutting down of the trees, and EIA, study of environmental impact assessment. What is renewable energy? Ladies and gentlemen, reusable natural energy is called renewable energy, and waste management, proper handling of waste. Ladies and gentlemen, we know environmental issues are directly connected with human survival, sustainable development, public health, and economic prosperity. Nepal's constitution guarantees environmental rights and emphasizes sustainable use of natural resources. Thank you, dear guys. Don't forget to comment in the below comment section.